Good. So we have Carlo Heissemberg, and we've talked about econal exponentiation and gravitational waves.
Yeah, let me start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to present this short talk and the associated poster, which are based on recent work done in collaboration with Paolo Di Vecchia, Rodolfo Russo, and Gabriele Veneziano. So this short presentation is meant to illustrate the context and showcase the main questions that I try to address in the posters, and they are all related to the classical limit of scattering amplitudes and how via the iconal exponentiation this can be used to extract precision calculations for classical gravitational dynamics, in particular for gravitational wave physics. So indeed, the main motivation to consider this connection has to do with the need for precision waveform templates, calculations that allow LIGO and Virgo experiments, for instance, to extract the genuine physical signal from the background noise, essentially. And so here I'm schematically depicting a black hole merger event, and in particular, the very early phase of this gravitational event is the so-called inspiral, in which the two bodies are still very far apart and orbit around each other, in fact, for a very long time. And in this regime, where the two bodies are hope to use perturbative techniques that are analytical, whereas the very last part is, of course, the domain of numerical relativity. So historically, two schemes have been very successful. The first one is maybe a bit more well-known. It's the so-called post-Newtonian, where essentially as a slogan, you expand in small velocities and also in small g, or more precisely, for small velocities, small ratios of the typical size of the bodies, g times some reference energy, say the center of mass energy or the mass, and their typical distance. And in this regime, people have essentially reached a frontier precision of 6 pn. But another scheme that has been revived essentially more recently due to the connection with gravitational amplitudes is the Phosphine-Koskinen regime, where essentially one stays agnostic with respect to the velocities of the bodies. And indeed, it's precisely this Lorentz invariance of this approximation that makes the connection to amplitudes rather natural. So here, essentially, very schematically, we are interested in calculating observables associated to the gravitational dynamics of two black holes that undergo a scattering event. So they go in with some initial velocities, they interact, albeit very weakly because they are very far apart, and eventually scatter off in some asymptotic directions. For instance, we are interested in calculating this deflection angle here, and we want to extract this information from a quantum amplitude. So the regime in which we want to extract information from this amplitude is, first of all, we want to be in a classical situation. So the quantum wavelength of these bodies, say h bar divided by the energy or the mass, should be much smaller than their typical sizes in order to suppress all quantum interference effects. And this is indeed the classical limit. And in order to guarantee that we are in the PM, Phosphine-Koskinen regime, we also need this two-length scale to be much smaller than the impact parameter B of the process. So again, this typical distance. And whereas this is indeed a perturbative parameter we can exploit for our calculations, you see that there is, in principle, naively a problem with using the only way we know how to calculate scattering amplitudes, which is the weak coupling perturbative expansion, where G is always expanded out. So G E squared is never big with respect to anything. But here, in fact, we want to go in this classical limit, which is intrinsically non-perturbative. So essentially, this is the first question I try to address in the poster, and this has to do with this iconal exponentiation I was mentioning at the beginning. One essentially needs to resum the amplitude in a suitable way in order to extract this classical limit, which is essentially non-perturbative, essentially extracting a very rapidly oscillating phase analogous to WKB phase, which also appeared in this morning lectures. And another question that I try to address, and in fact, is a solved issue at the leading order which disappears, which is the 3 p.m. order, is what about the radiation reaction? So in all the pictures I've drawn so far, I was essentially implicitly neglecting the fact that these objects do emit gravitational waves, which is the very reason we are interested in them. And so their trajectories are not only dictated by the potential interactions, the fact that these things feel each other's gravitational pull, but also emit, and therefore this emission back reacts on the trajectories, causing an additional deflection. This is called in the radiation reaction, and has been calculated at 3 p.m. as I was mentioning. And these radiation reaction effects are in fact very important in order to understand the high energy and low energy limits of the results, in particular of this deflection angle, and in fact grant a smooth high energy behavior. So for this deflection angle, one can take really the velocity to infinity. So one is really Lorentz invariant, as I was promising at the beginning. One can smoothly transition between the high energy regime of massive scattering and shockwave scattering, which was already considered in the 90s. But there are other quantities which seem to be more problematic, and this is related to some open issues that I'm trying to that we're trying to understand right now. In particular, the basic mechanism is that this small parameter characterizing the Phosphine-Koskinen expansion can be multiplied in principle by ratios of this type, so E, the energy divided by the mass of the object, and one needs to discuss whether this parameter then is small or large, which can affect in principle can break down your Phosphine-Koskinen approximation. So if you are interested to learn more, come to see my poster. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time for some quick questions.
So, how does it behave, this amplitude at fixed angle large S?
Fixed angle large S. So okay, this is actually not what we are discussing, right? Because as I was implicitly saying here, so essentially here we're in what you could call the Regge, more Regge type, and you're interested in sort of hard, what's it called? That's hard scattering, like deep inelastic scattering or something like that, I guess, right? Which is more related to the so it's not really something we can capture with this approximation. I think at some point we discussed this that there is a slight confusion in the connection with like the gross Mende approximation and the sort of Veneziano more iconal type approximation. So these are really two distinct regimes, I think.
So that we had another question. So maybe we quickly.
Sorry, an extremely naive question.
Yes,
extremely naive question. Sorry. How do you know that you're talking about the black holes? Because I mean, if you're in that limit, I mean, to my extremely naive understanding, they could be just stars, right? You don't see the.
That's right. Indeed. So to the very leading order in this approximation, what one can simply do is consider some point-like objects, and then one can add on top of this, precisely because, as you say, since the two things are so far apart, they are not really able to resolve each other's internal structure. One can add on top of that corrections associated to higher derivative operators in an effective field theory, and for instance, the introduce the love numbers and deformation or tidal deformations of these objects as additional parameters in an effective way. So, but to leading order, as you say, what we're doing here, in fact, is precisely to treat them as point particles. And okay, to leading order, up to some approximation, it appears to be compatible with doing scattering of Schwarzschild black holes. But for instance, what you can wonder about is scattering of Kerr black holes, which includes also spin, or of neutron stars, which includes tidal deformations. And these are really other directions that people have explored in quite some detail. In fact, for the Kerr case, I refer to Paolo Picchini's talk.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Let's give another round of applause.